Praise to you, Lord Christ. May the words on our lips and the meditations upon our hearts be always pleasing in your sight, O God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Please be seated. Today is a little light reading in the gospel. I think that it's fair to say that to call this passage a challenge would be an understatement. And not only is it challenging because of the gruesome and grotesque imagery that seems better fit for an episode of Game of Thrones or The Godfather than for a Sunday morning homily, but because it's simply difficult to discern what Mark is trying to tell us. Why is this story here? Why is it being told today of all days? What does the Spirit want us to hear? What, as I like to say, what would love have us do with this story? And it's very uncharacteristic of Mark's approach and style in general. Mark, as we've seen, is one who likes to spare us the details and get right to the point. I think Kate mentioned a couple of weeks ago that he opens his gospel with the words, "The beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God," and from that moment, it's just off to the races, hardly gives us a chance to take a breath, just bare minimum detail. That is until we come to today's passage. And here we find that Jesus isn't even the principal focus. And Mark has given several verses to give us not only the backstory of why John was arrested and why Herodias wanted him killed, but also giving us some insight into Herod's thoughts and his conflicted feelings, and not to mention just the gruesome details of this banquet, if you can call it that. Now, this is the one case where Mark actually goes into more detail than either Matthew or Luke. And of course, John does not mention this story at all. So clearly, this story matters to Mark. He really wants us to hear it, and he wants us to hear it now. But what's he trying to tell us? One way I think that we can start to get some insight into what Mark is doing is to look at how it fits into the larger narrative. A couple of weeks ago, I talked about Mark's love of using a story within a story. And this is actually another one of those stories within a story, but in this case, it's so long that we've broken it up into 3 weeks instead of seeing the whole thing on one reading. So this reading actually sits just after Jesus has sent the disciples 2 by 2 into the villages, into homes, to heal and to preach the gospel. And then them coming back to tell Jesus of all that they've done. So it's right there, sandwiched between them going out and coming back. And it's in this context of this overarching narrative of disciples being sent into the world that I think that we can start to see that this story is kind of a cautionary tale for those of us who would also be disciples and as such be sent into the world as partners in this ministry. But what exactly is being cautioned still depends on where we locate ourselves in the story and with whom we identify. As followers of Jesus, or people who are at least trying to follow Jesus, we quite naturally tend to identify with the figures who we know to be the heroes. And as such, I think our temptation might be to think that we're supposed to identify with John the Baptist, a friend of Jesus, the forerunner of Jesus' ministry. And if we do that, then this story appears to be a reminder of the reality of evil in the world. And that is something that we do need to hear. It's something we do need to remember. As wonderful as the message we have been entrusted with is, the fact remains that this good news is not going to always be well received, and especially by those whose power is firmly rooted in the status quo. And it's good for us to remember that the gospel is not a fairy tale. It's not a kind of Disney story where evil never really has a chance and where there's happily ever after. And I know we preach resurrection, and it's true that the good news is ultimately about life's triumph over death. The Gospels are incredibly frank in their acknowledgement of the realities of evil in the world. And this particular passage is especially remarkable in that regard because it's a really nuanced view of evil. We don't have this two-dimensional picture of evil, but we have something almost reminiscent of what Hannah Arendt would call the banality of evil, which came from her observation of the trials of Nazi war criminals, and the realization that sometimes great evils are not done by people with evil hearts or evil intention, but by normal, everyday folks who are doing what they're told, doing what they feel they have to do to get by and to protect themselves. And it would be very easy for Mark to paint us a picture of Herod as the bad guy, driven by greed, lust, thirst for power, full of malice. And in fact, I think it's worth noting that the ancient historian Josephus does talk about this event, and he says that the motive of Herod was to prevent a rebellion. And if Mark had painted us a similar picture, it'd be very easy for us then to fall into the fairy tale view, where we've got some obvious good guys and clearly delineated bad guys, and we see who's who, no problem. But as it stands, Mark's actually gone to great lengths to humanize Herod. So much so that, dare I say it, Herod is actually the most sympathetic character in today's story. And I don't mean by that Mark is trying to excuse Herod or that we're supposed to condone Herod's actions and decisions. Mark wants us to be appalled. But he also clearly doesn't want us to simply write off Herod as the bad guy. Herod is presented to us as complicated. He has just as much reason to hate John as his wife, and yet he's actually grown to appreciate John. He likes him. He sees him as a holy and righteous man. He's begun to value John's truth-telling and be intrigued by his vision of God's kingdom. But here, because of his drunken folly, he's put himself into a situation where he is forced to make a decision. And the choice is between protecting himself or protecting the innocent. And it seems to me that Mark actually wants us to put ourselves in the shoes of Herod and to sympathize as much as possible with Herod. Because even though the vast majority of us will never be in a situation where our choices can have such an immediate and gruesome consequences, we nevertheless have power. And we still have to make choices on how we use that power. And because our lives are deeply interconnected, those choices have bearing on the lives of others. We all exist within families, within communities, within an economic system, within an ecological system. And whether we see it immediately or not, the choices that we make impact others. And within this larger context of the sending of the disciples, we see that Jesus doesn't send them into battle as warriors in a hostile world. But rather, he sends them into villages, into homes, as healers being sent into a broken but deeply beloved world. And he entrusts them with this ministry of healing and grants them authority and power. And it's a power that we all possess, regardless of the reach of our influence, And so if this story of Herod is a cautionary tale, it is so that we might not take that power for granted, but remain ever vigilant in how we use it, always asking the question, who are we trying to protect?